November 16th, 1944, 14:23. Labor camp, Alberta foothills, Canada. Wind howled down from mountains that were visible as white-capped shadows through windows too high to provide view, carrying cold that penetrated wooden walls and made every breath taste of pine and ice. Frida Hartman sat on a wooden bench in what had been a logging camp mess hall, hands folded in her lap, spine rigid despite exhaustion from 3 weeks of transport. She was 32 years old. Before conscription, she'd been a secondary school teacher in Dresden, instructing students in literature and history. The Wehrmacht had drafted her into administrative services in 1942, filing, typing, maintaining personnel records at a supply depot outside Berlin. When Canadian forces captured her unit, not in combat, since her unit never saw combat, but through the cascading collapse of German forces across Europe, on October 24, 1944, 23 days ago, she'd expected execution or labor that would kill her gradually through exhaustion and inadequate rations. Instead, she'd gotten transport to England, then to Halifax, then across Canada by train to this, a converted logging camp in Alberta, where 72 German women waited to learn what labor camp meant in Canadian context. Around her, 71 other women sat on identical benches, arranged in rows facing a raised platform, where a Canadian officer stood reviewing papers on a clipboard. The officer was female, Major Catherine Walsh, 40-something, with auburn hair pinned severely back and an expression that showed exhaustion rather than hostility. Walsh had supervised their arrival, counted them multiple times, ensured they were fed and housed in barracks that were cold but weatherproof. Now she waited for something. An interpreter, perhaps, or instructions from command about what to do with 72 German women in a logging camp that had no logs to process, and no obvious work that required their labor. Beside Frida, Anna Klein whispered, "They'll announce the work assignments. Rock breaking, probably, or clearing forest. Something that destroys the body quickly." Her voice carried certainty rather than fear. Anna was 29, from Hamburg, had worked Wehrmacht communications. She'd survived the journey by assuming the worst about every transition, preparing mentally for horrors that hadn't yet materialized but surely would. Frida wanted to disagree, but couldn't summon arguments. Propaganda about prisoner labor camps had been explicit. Captured Germans would be worked until bodies failed, performing tasks that benefited Allied war effort while destroying prisoner health. The propaganda had cited specific examples: road construction, mining, agricultural labor in conditions designed to maximize productivity while minimizing prisoner survival time. Whether those examples were accurate or exaggerated didn't matter by 1944. They'd shaped expectation into certainty. An interpreter appeared on the platform beside Major Walsh. Older woman, maybe 60, with steel gray hair and features that suggested German heritage despite decades living elsewhere. She spoke German with Bavarian accent, introduced herself as Mrs. Gertrude Fischer, civilian liaison. Walsh began speaking in English, pausing after each sentence for Fischer to translate. "I am Major Catherine Walsh, camp administrator. You are prisoners of war, housed at Labor Camp 133, Alberta. You will work 6 days per week, 6 hours per day. Sunday is rest day. Work assignments begin tomorrow. Medical examinations occur this afternoon to ensure everyone is fit for assigned labor. Any questions?" 6 hours per day. The number didn't make sense. Labor camps worked prisoners 12 to 16 hours daily, maximizing extraction before bodies failed. 6 hours suggested either deception, announce 6, implement 16 once compliance was established, or some administrative error that would be corrected once actual work began. A hand raised from the back rows. Margaret Braun, 35, from Munich. Always the one who asked questions others were too cautious to voice. What type of work? Walsh consulted her clipboard before responding through Fischer. Educational instruction. You will teach English to French-Canadian workers who require language skills for post-war employment. 6 hours daily, 6 days per week. You'll be provided teaching materials, classroom space, and lesson plans. Standard teaching duties. The words hung in the cold air, making no sense individually, and even less sense assembled into sentences. Teaching? English? To French Canadians? Frida's mind couldn't process the information, couldn't fit it into any framework she'd constructed about prisoner labor camps and exploitation and being worked until death. If this makes you question everything you thought you knew, you're paying attention. Subscribe now. These stories deserve to be heard. For 12 years, Frida had absorbed propaganda about Allied treatment of German prisoners. The messaging had been specific. Prisoners would perform forced labor that benefited Allied economic and military interests, working under conditions that prioritized productivity over prisoner welfare. The propaganda films showed alleged labor camps where prisoners broke rocks for road construction, worked in mines extracting resources, performed agricultural labor in all weather conditions with minimal protection. The propaganda about educational work. There had been none. Education wasn't mentioned in any briefing Frida had attended, wasn't included in any framework for understanding what awaited captured personnel. Prisoners were laborers, equipment with temporary utility, bodies to be used until they broke. Teaching required treating prisoners as skilled professionals with knowledge worth transferring, as people rather than equipment. The cognitive dissonance was complete. Margaret wasn't satisfied with Walsh's answer. Teaching English. For how long? Until we're no longer useful, then we're transferred to actual labor camps? Walsh's expression showed something like understanding. For duration of war, or until repatriation? Whichever comes first. This is your work assignment. There is no second camp. This is where you work as teachers until war ends or you go home. Fisher added her own commentary after translating. Major Walsh is telling truth. I've been liaison here since camp opened in June. Previous groups of prisoners worked as teachers, completed their assignments, were repatriated when appropriate. This isn't deception. It's policy. The afternoon medical examinations were thorough but not invasive. Dr. Sarah Campbell, 48 civilian physician contracted by Canadian military, checked each woman for obvious health problems, tuberculosis symptoms, malnutrition indicators. She examined Frida with professional efficiency. You're underweight, but not critically. How long since you ate properly? Define properly. Frida's English was functional. She'd studied it in university, had maintained basic reading ability during the war. Enough food to feel satisfied rather than just survival rations. April 1943, 18 months. Campbell made notes. You'll receive adequate rations here. 3 meals daily. Approximately 2,500 calories. Should help you regain healthy weight. Any chronic pain or illness? No. Good. You're cleared for teaching duties. Report to classroom assignments tomorrow at 8 Hour. That evening, in the barracks that housed 20 women per building, Frida lay on her bunk. Thin mattress over wooden slats, 2 wool blankets, pillow that was barely more than folded fabric, and tried to process what she'd been told. Teaching English, 6 hours daily, adequate food, medical care. Duration of war, or until repatriation. None of it aligned with propaganda about labor camps, about exploitation, about being worked to death. Anna, on the bunk beside hers, voiced what Frida was thinking. It's a trap. They're evaluating us, determining who's most useful, who can be worked harder. The teaching is temporary assessment before actual labor begins. Or, Frida suggested carefully, it's exactly what they said. We teach English. That's our work. Why would they want German prisoners teaching Canadians anything? Because we speak German and English, and French-Canadian workers need English skills for employment, and using prisoners as teachers is more efficient than hiring civilian instructors. The pragmatism was compelling, but required accepting that prisoners had value beyond physical labor, that skills could be utilized rather than just bodies exploited. Frida had been a teacher for 8 years before conscription. She was good at teaching, patient, clear, able to explain complex concepts through simple examples. If Canada actually wanted English instruction for workers, she could provide that. But accepting that Canada wanted educational service rather than brutal labor required complete reconstruction of expectations. Morning came with bells at 06:30, breakfast at 07:00, porridge with milk, toast with butter, tea. The portions were generous, food was plain but adequate. Eating was unsupervised beyond guards ensuring order. At 07:45, Major Walsh appeared with classroom assignments. Hartman Frida, you're assigned to classroom 3. teaching intermediate English to 15 French-Canadian loggers. Classes run 8 duom to 14 wom with 1 hour lunch break at 11 duom. Teaching materials are in the classroom. Lesson plans are guidelines rather than requirements. Use your professional judgment. Professional judgment. The phrase suggested Walsh recognized Frida as teacher, rather than prisoner forced to teach, as professional with expertise, rather than laborer assigned task beyond her capability. The distinction was subtle, but significant. Classroom 3 was in a converted storage building. 4 walls, wood stove for heat, windows that provided actual light, desks arranged in rows facing a chalkboard. Teaching materials were stacked on a table near the front. English grammar textbooks, dictionaries, writing supplies, lesson plan templates created by previous teachers. The room smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke and possibility. Frida stood at the front of the classroom, hands trembling slightly as she examined the materials. This was real. This was an actual classroom with actual teaching supplies, and actual students who would arrive in 15 minutes, expecting actual instruction. She was a teacher again. Not just a prisoner, not just equipment, but a professional performing skilled labor that required her knowledge and judgment. The students arrived at 8 war, 15 French-Canadian men, ages ranging from early 20s to late 50s, loggers who'd been working in the camps before war and would return to logging work after. They filed in with mixture of curiosity and skepticism, taking seats at the desks that were clearly too small for adult men. Their supervisor, Claude Fontaine, 46, camp foreman, introduced them briefly. These men need English for working with Anglophone crews after war. They know basic phrases. You teach them enough to communicate professionally. Questions? Frida had hundreds of questions, but only one that mattered immediately. What level? Complete beginners or intermediate? Intermediate. They understand simple English. They need to improve. The first lesson was awkward. Frida's English was functional but not fluent. Her teaching style was designed for teenagers rather than adult men, and her students were clearly uncomfortable being taught by a German prisoner. But she worked through the awkwardness by focusing on practical communication, workplace vocabulary, common phrases for coordinating tasks, pronunciation drills that made everyone self-conscious but improved comprehension. By 11 fa, when lunch break arrived, she'd established basic rapport. The students weren't hostile, just wary, uncertain whether to treat her as teacher or prisoner, whether to respect her expertise or resent her nationality. She'd dealt with similar dynamics teaching in Dresden, when new students didn't want to learn from young female teacher. The solution was the same. Demonstrate competence, maintain professionalism, earn respect through quality instruction, rather than demanding it through authority. Lunch was provided in the mess hall: soup, bread, fruit. Frida ate with other prisoner teachers, women who'd been teaching for days or weeks, and had advice about managing French-Canadian students who were learning English from German instructors. The advice was practical. Focus on pronunciation, use lots of examples. Don't be offended when students make jokes about German accents. It's how they process the strangeness of the situation. The afternoon session was more comfortable. Frida introduced written exercises, having students write simple paragraphs about their work, then correcting grammar and vocabulary individually. The work was familiar, satisfying in the way teaching had always been satisfying. Seeing comprehension develop, watching students grasp concepts they'd struggled with, knowing her instruction made actual difference in their capability. At 14, Claude collected his men, thanked Frida in careful English. Good teaching, thank you. See tomorrow. And the classroom emptied. Frida sat at the desk, exhausted but not from physical labor. Teaching for 6 hours was mentally exhausting in a completely different way from physical work. Concentration required for explaining concepts, patience needed for answering questions, satisfaction of seeing progress rather than just surviving the day. Major Walsh appeared at 14:15 with an unexpected question. How did it go? Any problems? No problems. Students are intermediate as described. They need pronunciation work and vocabulary expansion. I can teach that. Good. If you need additional materials, submit requests through Mrs. Fisher. We'll provide what we can through supply channels. The offer was startling. Prisoners requesting teaching materials and receiving them, as though their educational effectiveness mattered enough to invest resources. Frida made mental note of materials that would help. More advanced grammar texts, pronunciation guides, perhaps maps or pictures for teaching geographical vocabulary. Over the following days, teaching became routine. Morning bells, breakfast, 6 hours in classroom 3, lunch, afternoon session, dinner, evening hours in the barracks. The routine was predictable rather than chaotic, structured rather than deliberately exhausting. The work was intellectual rather than physical, utilizing skills rather than just extracting labor from bodies. By the second week, Frida had developed relationship with her students that was professional but not hostile. Pierre Dubois, 24, youngest in the class, showed particular aptitude for grammar and stayed after class to ask questions about verb conjugations. Marcel Rousseau, 53, oldest student, struggled with pronunciation but worked diligently, accepting correction without resentment. Henri Beaumont, 37, made jokes that sometimes crossed into inappropriate territory but responded well when Frida redirected him with teacher's glare that transcended language barriers. Claude, the foreman, checked in weekly. Men are improving. I hear them using English phrases during work. Good progress. The validation was gratifying. Her teaching was effective, measurably improving students' capabilities, serving genuine purpose rather than being performative gesture. She was contributing skilled labor that benefited actual people. And that contribution was recognized rather than being exploited invisibly. In the third week, Mrs. Fisher brought unexpected news. Major Walsh approved your request for additional materials. Supply office located used textbooks from Alberta schools. They're being shipped here. Should arrive next week. Frida had submitted the request, half expecting it to be denied or ignored. Prisoners requesting better resources for teaching seemed presumptuous. But Walsh had approved it. Supply office had located materials, and institutional machinery had moved to support her effectiveness as teacher. The investment suggested her teaching mattered enough to justify resource allocation. The textbooks arrived on schedule. 10 copies of an intermediate English grammar text, slightly worn but functional, with exercises and examples that would significantly improve her teaching capability. Frida distributed them to students at the next class. These are yours. Keep them. Practice exercises at home if you want to progress faster. Pierre examined his copy carefully, running fingers over the cover. This is mine? To keep? Yes, for learning. Thank you, Mademoiselle Hartmann. The formality was touching, using teacher's title rather than prisoner designation, treating her as professional rather than enemy. That evening, Frida sat in the barracks with the textbook that was hers, the teacher's edition, more comprehensive than student versions, with teaching notes and answer keys. She'd requested textbooks to improve her teaching. Major Walsh had approved. Supply office had provided. And now she held physical evidence that her teaching mattered enough to invest resources, that her skills were valued rather than just her labor exploited. Anna noticed her examining the book. They gave you teaching materials. That's unexpected. They want me to teach effectively. Effective teaching requires proper materials. The logic is straightforward. The logic assumes they care about prisoners being effective rather than just extracting minimum acceptable labor. Frida couldn't argue with that observation. Everything about this camp, the 6-hour workdays, the adequate food, the teaching assignments, the provision of requested materials, suggested that effectiveness mattered, that prisoner skills were valued, that the goal was quality instruction, rather than just punishment disguised as labor. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war, and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. By the 4th week, teaching had become so routine that Frida sometimes forgot she was prisoner rather than civilian instructor. The forgetting happened during class, when she was focused on explaining grammar concepts, when Pierre asked insightful questions, when Marcel finally mastered pronunciation that had eluded him for weeks, when the work itself became consuming enough that her status as prisoner receded into background awareness rather than foreground defining characteristic. But the barracks at night reminded her. The locked doors, the guards conducting evening counts, the shared quarters with 71 other women who were equally displaced and uncertain. She was prisoner being allowed to teach, not teacher who happened to be prisoner. The distinction mattered even when daily experience blurred boundaries. In the 5th week, Dr. Campbell conducted follow-up medical examinations. Frida had gained 8 pounds, moving from dangerously underweight toward merely thin. Her color was better, energy levels were higher, chronic cough from months of inadequate nutrition had resolved. Campbell noted improvements. The work here, teaching rather than physical labor, plus adequate food is helping you recover health. Continue current routine. The casual acknowledgement that teaching was less physically demanding than alternative labor, that recovery was goal rather than irrelevant side effect, reinforced the pattern Frida had been observing. This camp operated with different priorities than propaganda had described. Prisoner welfare mattered enough to assign work that allowed recovery rather than accelerated deterioration. By the 6th week, Frida's students had improved measurably. Pierre could write coherent paragraphs with minimal grammatical errors. Marcel's pronunciation had improved enough that he could be understood by Anglophone speakers. Henri had learned to channel his humor into appropriate classroom participation rather than disruptive comments. The progress was real, documented through exercises and assessments, visible in their increased confidence when using English. Claude acknowledged this during his weekly check. The men tell me Mademoiselle Hartmann is excellent teacher, better than civilian instructors we had before war. They're learning faster with better attitude. The comparison to civilian instructors suggested Frida wasn't just adequate despite being prisoner. She was actually better than alternatives, because her professional training and experience made her effective teacher regardless of her current status. The validation was professional rather than personal, which made it more credible. In the 7th week, Major Walsh made an announcement that changed everything. War situation suggests extended timeline before repatriation is possible. Camp will continue operations indefinitely. Prisoners who demonstrate teaching effectiveness may request additional responsibilities: curriculum development, training other prisoner teachers, advanced instruction. These positions come with small stipends paid in camp currency that can be used at commissary. Stipends. Payment for labor beyond basic requirement to work. Recognition that exceptional performance deserved compensation even for prisoners. The policy rested on assumption that prisoners were capable of excellence, rather than just compliance, that merit could be rewarded even within captivity. Frida considered requesting curriculum development responsibilities. She'd been teaching long enough to see where lesson plans were weak, where materials needed expansion, where structure could be improved. If Walsh was willing to compensate curriculum work, Frida was willing to do it. Not for the small stipend, which wouldn't buy much at commissary, but for the recognition that her professional expertise was valuable enough to justify additional responsibility and compensation. She submitted request through Mrs. Fisher. I would like to develop improved curriculum for intermediate English instruction, incorporating workplace vocabulary and practical communication scenarios specific to logging industry. Estimated time, 10 hours over 2 weeks beyond regular teaching duties. Walsh approved within 2 days. Fisher delivered the news. Major Walsh says yes. She's interested in seeing improved curriculum because other camps are requesting teaching materials. If yours is good, it might be distributed to other facilities. You'll be paid in camp currency, equivalent to 1 week's civilian instructor wages. 1 week's civilian wages for 10 hours of curriculum work. The rate was fair, possibly generous considering she was prisoner whose labor technically belonged to military administration. But the fairness was the point. Walsh was treating her as professional contractor, rather than prisoner whose labor could be extracted without compensation. Frida spent 2 weeks developing curriculum during evening hours, sitting in the barracks with the textbook and writing supplies she'd requested and received. She designed lesson plans that integrated grammar instruction with practical vocabulary, created exercises that used logging scenarios for context, developed assessment rubrics that measured both comprehension and practical application. The work was intensely satisfying. She was doing what she'd trained to do, what she'd loved doing before war interrupted everything, what she was good at. Teaching for 6 hours daily was satisfying. Creating curriculum that would improve teaching for others was deeply fulfilling because it extended her impact beyond her own classroom. Anna watched her work with mixture of confusion and grudging respect. You're working extra hours for almost no payment. Why? Because I'm good at this. Because the work matters. Because I'm creating something useful that will persist beyond my presence here. You're a prisoner. The work only matters because they're exploiting your skills. Maybe. But they're compensating me fairly, treating me as professional, distributing my curriculum to other camps. If this is exploitation, it's more respectful than anything I experienced in Wehrmacht service. The comparison was apt. Wehrmacht had conscripted her, assigned her administrative work that used none of her teaching skills, paid her minimal salary, and provided no recognition for professional capabilities. Canada was using her teaching skills, compensating her fairly for additional work, recognizing her professional expertise. The contrast was stark enough that even captivity in Canada felt more professionally respectful than service in her own military had been. When the curriculum was complete, Frida submitted it to Walsh through Fisher. Walsh reviewed it personally, called Frida to her office for the first private conversation they'd had. This is excellent work, professional quality. I'm forwarding it to Regional Command for distribution to other teaching camps. Your payment will be credited to your commissary account. Thank you for the extra effort. The thanks was unexpected. Acknowledgement that extra effort deserved appreciation, that professional work merited recognition beyond just payment. Walsh treated her as colleague rather than prisoner, professional rather than forced laborer, person whose contribution was valued rather than equipment being utilized. Frida left the office holding the textbook, the teacher's edition she'd been using for 2 months, which Walsh had allowed her to keep beyond just classroom use. The book had become symbol of everything that challenged her expectations about captivity, the reality that skilled labor was valued, that professional expertise was compensated, that teaching was work that mattered, rather than just punishment disguised as employment. By the 8th week, rumors of German surrender were circulating. The war in Europe was collapsing. Final defeat was inevitable, rather than just possible. Repatriation would eventually occur, though timing remained unclear. Frida faced the same complicated question as prisoners in other camps: return to destroyed Germany, or apply for extended stay as civilian worker if that option existed. She discussed it with Pierre during a post-class conversation. The war is ending. I will return to Germany eventually, but I don't know what awaits there. You could stay. Canada needs teachers. French Canadians need English instruction. You're good teacher. Maybe, he struggled with vocabulary, maybe refugee status or work permit. The possibility hadn't occurred to her. Stay in Canada? Work as civilian teacher? The teaching here had been more professionally satisfying than anything she'd experienced in Germany. But staying meant abandoning family, homeland, everything familiar. I'll think about it. In the 9th week, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Prisoners awaited repatriation processing, which would occur gradually as transportation and reception facilities in Germany were established. Walsh announced timeline. Preliminary repatriation would begin in autumn. Full completion would take until early 1946. Frida had 6 months to decide: return to Dresden, which might be in ruins, or apply to stay in Canada if that option was available. The teaching work had shown her that her skills were valued in Canada, that professional respect was possible even as former enemy, that building life here might be more feasible than rebuilding in destroyed Germany. Mrs. Fisher mentioned during a conversation, some prisoners will be offered contracts as civilian teachers. If Regional Command approves, if you're interested, if security clearances can be obtained. Not guaranteed, but possible. Would you want that? Yes, if possible. In the 10th week, Frida received notification. Her curriculum had been distributed to 6 other camps, was being used by dozens of prisoner teachers, had been praised by Regional Education Coordinator as exactly the practical, contextual approach needed for adult learners in vocational settings. And the validation was professional. Recognition from education professionals rather than just military administrators. Acknowledgement that her work met professional standards rather than just being adequate for prison camp purposes. Claude brought additional validation. My men tested for English proficiency. All 15 passed at intermediate level or higher. Previous classes had 50% pass rate. Mademoiselle Hartmann's teaching is much more effective. The comparison wasn't just to other prisoner teachers, but to all previous instruction at the camp. Frida's teaching was objectively better because her professional training and experience made her better teacher. And that superiority was measurable through student outcomes rather than just subjective assessment. By the 11th week, Frida had made her decision. She would apply to stay in Canada if permitted, seek civilian teaching work, build life here rather than return to uncertain future in destroyed Germany. The decision felt like betrayal, of family, of homeland, of identity as German. But it also felt like choosing herself for the first time in years, choosing professional fulfillment over obligation, choosing place where her skills were valued over place where nothing but ruins awaited. She submitted application through Fisher. I request permission to remain in Canada after repatriation processing, seeking civilian employment as teacher. I have professional qualifications, demonstrated teaching effectiveness, and willingness to contribute to Canadian educational needs. Walsh's response came within a week. Application approved pending security clearance. You'll transition from prisoner status to civilian worker status upon completion of repatriation processing. Contract will be offered for teaching position at vocational school in Calgary. Housing assistance will be provided. Congratulations. On Frida's last day as prisoner, March 15th, 1946, she stood in classroom 3 for final lesson with students she'd been teaching for 4 months. The men had invited Claude to attend, had prepared something. Pierre explained in careful English. We want to thank you. You are good teacher. Better than we expected from German prisoner. You made us learn when we didn't want to learn. That is good teaching. They presented her with a book. New copy of advanced English grammar text, inscribed by all 15 students with messages in English they'd written themselves. Marcel's inscription was simple but touching. Thank you for patience. You teach good. I learn much. Frida held the book carefully, feeling its weight and the smoothness of new pages. This was her 3rd book. The textbook Walsh had let her keep, the curriculum she'd developed, and now this gift from students who'd become more than just assignments. 3 books, 3 forms of recognition that her teaching mattered. Institutional approval through textbook provision, professional recognition through curriculum distribution, personal gratitude through student gift. That evening, Walsh conducted final interview. You've been exemplary prisoner, excellent teacher, professional asset to this facility. Your transition to civilian status is approved. You'll receive standard teacher's salary, benefits, housing assistance. You're no longer prisoner. You're colleague. Welcome to Canada. The transformation from prisoner to colleague required single administrative act, signing papers that transferred her status. But the psychological journey had taken 4 months of teaching that challenged every expectation about captivity and labor and what enemies did to prisoners. Decades later, in a modest Calgary apartment, Frida Hartmann, never married, taught English as second language for 40 years, retired but still tutoring part-time, kept 3 books on a special shelf in her study. The teacher's edition from Camp 133, worn from 2 months of daily use. The curriculum she'd developed, typed formally, and bound in leather by the grateful school district where she'd worked for 3 decades. And the gift from her first Canadian students, with inscriptions in English they'd learned from German prisoner who became their favorite teacher, her great-niece, visiting from Germany where Frida's family had eventually rebuilt, asked about the books one afternoon. Tante Frida, why do you keep these old textbooks? They're so outdated now. Frida was preparing tea, habit from 7 decades that she'd never abandoned. She set down the pot and retrieved the 3 books, arranging them on the table. These books represent the moment I learned that my skills had value even when I had no power, that professional expertise transcends nationality and captivity, that teaching is work that matters regardless of who's doing it or under what circumstances. But you were a prisoner. Weren't you forced to teach? I was assigned to teach. But I chose to teach well. That distinction, between doing minimum required and doing excellent work, that was mine to control even when everything else was controlled by others. These books are evidence that I chose excellence even in captivity, that my professional standards mattered more than my status as prisoner, that teaching well was a form of resistance against being reduced to just prisoner. What do you mean, resistance? Propaganda taught that prisoners were exploited labor, bodies to be used until broken. But teaching required treating me as skilled professional, compensating me fairly for extra work, recognizing my expertise. By teaching excellently, I forced them to acknowledge I was more than just prisoner. I was teacher, whose contribution mattered. That acknowledgement challenged their ability to dehumanize me, even though I was enemy and prisoner. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember, and why. The 3 books returned to their shelf, arranged precisely by size. Frida taught ESL students that afternoon, habit she'd maintained into her 80s, working with refugees and immigrants who needed English skills for employment. The work was the same work she'd done for 40 years, the same work she'd started doing in Camp 133 in November 1944, teaching English to people who needed it, using skills that had value regardless of political circumstances, or her status as prisoner or civilian or citizen. The measure of civilization isn't found in its weapons or its victories. It's found in textbooks provided to prisoner teachers so they can teach effectively, in curriculum developed by prisoners that's distributed to other camps because it's professionally excellent, in students who write inscriptions, thanking German prisoner for being good teacher who made them learn even when they didn't want to. And the measure of dignity is found in choosing to do excellent work even when compliance would be sufficient, in maintaining professional standards even when no one would blame you for doing minimum required, in teaching well, because teaching well is who you are rather than just what you're assigned to do. The war had taught millions that prisoners were slave labor, that captivity meant exploitation, that enemies worked captured personnel until bodies failed. But in a logging camp in Alberta, a different lesson was taught through 3 books. Skilled labor can be valued even when laborer is prisoner. Professional expertise transcends nationality and status, and sometimes the most profound resistance to dehumanization is simply doing your work excellently when adequate would be expected. Sometimes civilization is measured in books, in textbooks provided so prisoner teachers can teach effectively, in curriculum developed by prisoners that meets professional standards high enough for distribution, in gifts from students who learned that German prisoner was excellent teacher, that teaching transcends nationality, that professional respect can exist even across lines of war and captivity. The books testified to this truth. 3 volumes spanning 40 years of teaching, reminder that professional identity can't be taken away through captivity, that choosing excellence even when coerced is a form of resistance more powerful than compliance, that skilled work valued and compensated fairly transforms captivity from exploitation into something more complicated. Still imprisonment, yes, but imprisonment where expertise matters and professional contribution is recognized, and books accumulate as evidence that you're more than just prisoner. You're teacher, and good teaching is work that matters regardless of circumstances. Sometimes the most important resistance is simply refusing to do mediocre work when excellence is possible. Teaching well when adequate would suffice. Developing curriculum when just following existing plans would be acceptable. Requesting materials that will improve your teaching when making do with what you have would be easier. Each choice to pursue excellence rather than adequacy is assertion that you're professional with standards that transcend your status as prisoner, that your work matters because work itself matters, that teaching is calling rather than just assignment. The book sat on the shelf, 3 testimonies to 40 years of excellent teaching that began in prisoner camp and continued through citizenship and career and retirement. Evidence that professional identity is more durable than political circumstances, that skilled labor retains value across contexts, that the teacher who maintained professional standards even as prisoner continued maintaining those standards for 40 more years because teaching well is who she was, rather than just what she'd been forced to do.